Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to our fourth episode of The Looking Glass. Tonight we have the pleasure, this evening, we have the
It's gonna go into
pleasure,
the night.
yeah, exactly, the pleasure to host Vlad Glaveanu. I hope I pronounced that properly.
Perfect.
He is the head of the Department of Psychology and Counseling at Webster University Geneva, so a very good colleague of mine. Associate professor at Bergen University in Norway as well, and director of the Webster Center for Creativity and Innovation. Uh, his work focuses on creativity, imagination, culture, collaboration, societal challenges, and he received, also because of this reason, I guess, in 2018, the Berline Award from the American Psychological Association for outstanding early career contributions to the field of aesthetics, creativity, and the arts. And I would add that he's also the organizer of the Creativity Week, which unfortunately we had to kind of cancel or have it
Postpone.
postponed to next year. So I thought that you are the best person to talk about creativity in the age of coronavirus. And so we are here to
Right.
listen to you talking.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Francesco. Thanks for the invitation. Let me see if I can get my PowerPoint up. Yes, now that you've stopped sharing, I'm gonna start sharing. Here we go. Share. Do you see it? Yes, hopefully. So I'm going to share with you some reflections that started a little bit before the coronavirus big episodes that we're still living through, but that really got kind of to a boiling point intellectually for me, conceptually and practically, experientially with the lockdown. So I've been gradually, for the past 10 years or more than 10 years, I worked on the topic of creativity and different things related to creativity, imagination, wonder, more recently, and so on. But over the past 2 years, I started using the notion of possibility and the possible as a kind of a bigger umbrella in a way for the phenomenon of creativity. I'm gonna, discuss a little bit more now today, but also as a way of getting at the heart of why did I start with creativity in the first place? What got me interested in creativity? And really, for me, it boils down to the question of how we live both in worlds of the here and now, and at the same time, and even in this talk, you're listening to me, you're in your own environment. Our minds, our imagination travels to different places. We construct alternatives. We look towards the future. We hypothesize. We do many, many things that expand our horizon of possibility for our thinking, for our action, even for the way we are, for our way of being. So this idea of human possibility, what expands it, what constricts it, what eliminates it at the same time, right? For me, is a very interesting and kind of challenging topic. And more recently, and this happened indeed this year, I added, and I should have added it before because Richard, who's on and who's our colleague, our sociologist in the department, he's been telling me about mobility and sending me papers for for a number of years. But I got into it because I worked on migration on the one hand, and then I started thinking more deeply about the relation between what it means to be mobile, to live a mobile life, and we all live mobile lives, even if we don't migrate, or many of us did migrate. Many of us on this chat now, we are migrants. But even not at that level, how mobility might relate to possibility, and also the reverse, how immobility might relate to impossibility. So what I'm going to do today, I'm going to tell you a little bit, of course, about creativity, about the pandemic, and I'm going to present to you actually the outline of a book. So during this pandemic, one of the things I've done, I wrote a short book. It is a short book. I'm happy to share, by the way, when it comes out. It should come out this year. It's called Mobility and Human Possibility, and it's with Palgrave. So I'm going to present to you, basically it's going to be the first time I'm talking about the structure of the book, and hopefully I didn't do many mistakes or said outrageous things there, but we're going to see in the discussion. Okay, so first of all, I'm a psychologist. So before being a creativity researcher, I'm a psychologist, and for a psychologist, the whole context of the pandemic, the lockdown, it raises serious issues and serious questions. And here you have on the side just a few of the issues that came up, and I'm sure you're very well aware. Either you read them in magazines or discussed about them and so on. But mental health and well-being obviously impacted heavily by the whole situation of social isolation and lockdown. Anxiety and increasing anxiety, panic attacks, and yeah, feeling anxious generally about one's own health and safety and the one of family and friends. I mean, I have parents living in Bucharest, in Romania. Obviously, we are separated, borders are closed. And yeah, I think about them every day and about their state of mind, state of health. And I would dread to think what happens when people have to cope from afar with the passing of someone dear and the process of grieving. And how do people grieve when they are more or less alone? We're never fully alone, but we are isolated. Other issues that come that are, again, quite psychological in nature have to do with what happens to our bodies and our minds during lockdown. So excessive food consumption, I'm guilty of that. Alcohol consumption, it's quite well documented. Lack of exercise. I mean, the many ways in which the pandemic is affecting our physical and mental health. And then you have the social aspects. Of course, we are more or less isolated, but we also live with partners, with family, and there are many things about homeschooling, about the challenges of that. But for some people, there are very serious issues related to living with abusive partners, for instance. So kind of a hike in domestic violence and a concern for that during this period. And then you have broader issues in which we live in Switzerland, many of us. I saw people connecting from the US and other places. And in some countries, there was already either a bit of a totalitarian regime or regimes waiting to be totalitarian. And many of them might find excuses, and we read that in the news, to actually persecute even more activists, right? And all the laws that are being kind of emergency state type of legislation that as a side effect, or maybe as a main effect in some countries, is actually persecuting vocal groups or individuals in society. So we have a wide range of issues and concerns that go from social, political to clinical psychology. And many on this list are actually negative. Everything I told you about, getting fat or chubby and drinking more and so on and being anxious, they're quite negative. But of course, it's not only negative things that happen during the lockdown. I'm going to review some of the brighter or silver linings of being in lockdown and what people do creatively with it. And I thought about this because, as a creativity researcher, I came across issues like this. So I don't know if you saw this piece of news. It was from some time ago. Man runs marathon on 7-meter balcony during French lockdown. I mean, amazing. I couldn't, but I got quite inspired. And I thought to myself, wow, what a great example of creativity, right? That is not only for the self. I mean, arguably, this man didn't run a marathon just to feel healthy and do all that. That is part of it, but in a way, it was kind of showing support with others, demonstrating for other people what might be possible to do, even in these conditions of imposed impossibility, if you want. So that's one example. And then you had stuff like another guy trekked to Everest base camp by climbing the stairs at home. So these are real news items. They're from The Guardian. So this person ascended 5,364 meters over 5 days in indoor mountain climbing challenges. So here it's again an issue of the individual, but also the community we're part of. From what I read in this paper, in the particular article, this guy was, of course, a trekker, and many people have been disappointed. We all had to cancel many things, during the lockdown. And there are people who said, you know what, we don't have to cancel this. We can still be part of this community of trekking up to the Everest, even as we're at home. So he found quite a creative way to do that. And of course, we don't run kilometers after kilometers on our balconies. We might not have staircases in our house, but some of us might have kids, or anyway, we live with other people, and we want to make the situation for them sometimes more light and more fun. One thing for families, for instance, and maybe some of you will recognize yourselves here, parents started creating all sorts of opportunities for children indoors. So from kind of hiking again, in a way, to all sorts of kind of challenge courses with obstacles and all sorts of challenges. My wife is preparing, I mean, I would love to say with my help, but she's the creator on this one. She's preparing a quiet book for our girl, for our little baby girl, and there's so much creativity in trying to make the circumstances bearable for oneself and for others. So these examples are much more positive. They talk about human resilience, they talk about inventivity, they talk about creativity proper, I would say. So the question that I want to raise today, and I don't want to spend too much time talking about it, but is first of all, what happens to our creativity in situations like this one, extreme situations like the lockdown, and how creativity might actually support us through the context we're living in. But behind this question, I have a broader question that I want to raise, which is the relationship between mobility and possibility, immobility and impossibility. Because as I said, I find that there is this bigger resonance or bigger conceptual issue to think about. And in this regard, as I note here, I've got some bad news and some good news. So I'm going to start a bit with the bad news. They're not really that bad, don't worry. But before I do, I want to just have one slide about mobility and one slide about possibility, just to clarify one more time what I mean by this. And again, Richard, I'm sure will have a question because I start by saying a paradigm and he's questioning this. But nonetheless, there is a movement, if you want, that started somehow in sociology, mainly at the turn of this century with the work of Uri, who passed away in the meantime. And other colleagues, but also in geography and anthropology and archaeology. I mean, it really spread through the social sciences. Sadly, it didn't reach psychology much. And yeah, if I have a moment, I'll talk about that a bit later. But what this paradigm or this orientation wants us to do is to examine much more seriously all these diverse mobilities of people, of objects, of images, of information, even of waste. I mean, everything that is on the move in society and that makes up society through this kind of movement, the complex interdependencies between and social consequences of diverse mobilities. So Uri and colleagues, he had quite an ambitious kind of aim. He wanted, you know, as a sociologist, he of course was interested in the study of society, and he basically deconstructed the notion that we live in societies that are stable, homogeneous. You know, what is our society? How do we envision it? What is stable and permanent, and what gives it its identity? And basically, he and other colleagues proposed a completely new vocabulary to think about these realities in very dynamic terms. So looking at flows and scapes and networks and things like that. But what's important to take away is that the notion of mobilities is not reduced to you traveling abroad or migrating, right? So it is the corporeal physical travel of people, but it's also the way objects move. It's also our mobilities in virtual spaces right now, for instance, right? And it's also the movement of minds, if you want, the imaginative travel that we do all the time. So it's a very wide kind of understanding that focuses us on movement and the role of movement in the constitution of the self and in the constitution of society. Now, what is possibility and what are possibility studies, I call them? So this is a much more recent, it's both very old and very recent, but I'm trying to propose it as an interdisciplinary, definitely interdisciplinary, and emerging field of research in between many of the social sciences and humanities primarily, concerned with how we live both as individuals and as communities and societies, not only within the here and now of our daily experience, immediate experience of the world, but also at the same time, so we're not excluding the present and the here and now, but we also engage at any moment with something that is not in our present, is not in our perception. We go back into the past, sometimes the past we didn't even live ourselves, the past of our country, of our ancestors. We never witnessed that, but we can reach it with our minds, right? Into the future, we plan. What will we have for dinner after my talk? Hopefully something good. And even further, how will life be in the 22nd century? and also in spaces of possibility of what is likely to happen, and what is impossible to happen. The impossible has a big role to play, as I will talk a little bit later, in understanding possibility. By being faced with something that is initially impossible, we get a challenge that we might work towards and make it possible. So the impossible itself is a temporary category in many ways, as long as you can think about it. Okay, so what does possibility studies include? I would say that anyone interested in creativity, innovation, imagination, play, pretend play, wonder, counterfactual thinking, as if, what if type of thinking, serendipity, anticipation, future studies is a huge area for many decades now. Everyone is contributing a little bit to this bigger theme. And actually, there is an encyclopedia that I'm editing, and many of you here are contributing or being senior editors for that project. So whoever wants to know more, there will be volumes to read on that. So what's the bad news? Okay, so the bad news, because we're still kind of in lockdown, is that the premise of my book and my assumption is that mobility is a necessary condition for possibility. Okay, so it's quite simple and a bit depressing, because you'd think, oh, but we are kind of immobile, so no possibility. Obviously not. So what I'm saying here is not that it's a necessary and sufficient condition. It doesn't mean that if you are a globetrotter and you go everywhere, your field of possibility will be enormous. You're going to be super imaginative and super creative. It's not as linear as that, right? It's not a causal linear relationship. There are many more things that need to come into place for mobile people to also be very creative people, right? But there is an ontological reality. There is, I'm making an ontological claim, which might be a bit risky, but I'm talking about how things are in a way that it is because of the fact that we're not trapped within singular positions in the world, that we can go to a new position, move between positions, exchange our position physically, socially, imaginatively, that we get a new perspective, right? Because every time you change your position, as you're going to go out of this room, you're going to see a different side of the world. You're going to have a different visual perspective. It's the same way when you adopt a different role. You're a teacher at Webster, you're a parent at home, you have very different positions, you move between them, and already the world will appear quite different to you, right? So new perspectives emerge, and perspectives for me are the essence of possibility, right? So mobility is related intrinsically to possibility. And I have four strands of arguing for this. I'm looking at four different kind of timelines. One is super broad and then going into the very kind of here and now of the present. So if we look at human history, if we look at objects on the move, because we have very few human remains in the history of humanity, but we have quite a few objects produced, very early technological innovations produced by people. So I think someone has the microphone on. Sorry, if everyone can or if the person can mute it. Sorry for that. Or if Francesco can help me with that. So so the first category, yes, is how objects have been on the move for a very long historical period. And if we look at early technological innovations, I mean, we have here stones that are chiseled, to create weapons and so on. But we can think about the invention of, I know, the wheel and the papyrus and so on. These are really markers of human possibility that builds entire civilizations. We explore what's possible. We change our environment. We accumulate culture of sorts. These are fundamental things that define us as human beings. And if we look back, and I don't have the time to go into many details, these innovations all depended on two things, basically. One was demography. So how big was the human community? The bigger the group, the more likely it was that an innovation would occur. And the second one, very important, was migration. The fact that from the very early, hominids up to the present time, the movement of people in groups and putting groups in contact meant that objects could be exchanged as gifts, or could be conquered or taken, could inspire other groups to continue to use them, to improve them, and so on. So the link between innovation, which is an aspect of possibility for me, and migration, early migration, is very well documented through the movement of objects. And there is a line of research well developed within, well, sociology, but also social psychology and other fields. It's called the diffusion of innovations. And it's basically making that S curve of adopting an innovation. You have early adopters, and then people start to catch on, and then you have late adopters. You know, I'm often a late adopter of many things. But what this kind of research in the diffusion of innovations paradigm or orientation or theory shows is that human contact, networks of communication, the way you talk informally with others will influence crucially how an innovation is diffused within society. So that's the first kind of line of argument, that if you look at human history, the history of our species, migration, mass migration, and technological development went very often hand in hand. The second part is about ideas. So I'm not trying to say here that objects and ideas are completely separate. Obviously, an object has a physical element to it, but it also carries a bit the worldview and the approach and the conception, right, of certain people, individuals or groups. So as ideas, as objects traveled, ideas and worldviews traveled with them. And in many ways, the history of society is a history of ideas that come and go and respond to each other and sometimes fight and clash. I mean, you can think about ideological, Cold War type of struggles between paradigms and ideas. In psychology, we have, and in cognitive science and evolutionary kind of biology, we have different theories of how ideas circulate. One of them is called meme theory. It doesn't have to do with the memes I'm gonna talk to you about a bit later, but it's about units of culture. And the other one is called the epidemiology of representations. These are theories that basically say that ideas circulate from person to person by first existing in the public domain, and then they become internalized by the person. They're turned into mental representation, and then this mental representation makes you generate a new object or express something in language and put it back in the public domain. So it's a very kind of Cartesian, inside the mind, outside of the mind type of paradigm. But this is not the one that I'm following. I'm actually a sociocultural psychologist, and here you have a richness of accounts of how, again, group contact and exchanges between groups are at the heart of cultural change. Sir Frederick Bartlett, for instance, one of the big names who was an early, 20th century psychologist and anthropologist in many ways, documented how the culture of a group is actually shaped, and especially the novelties, the possibilities of it are shaped by contact and migration, movement of people. So if we go to people, human movement, both inside and outside of national boundaries, the way we define them today, is what really grounds very often the movement of objects, the movement of ideas. They don't move alone. It's often in and through the movement of people, right? And there is a very large field of migration studies today. And the literature is kind of split. If you think about the relation between creativity, imagination, and possibility and migration, there are some people who are very positive about it, and they talk about how migrants, even in the harshest conditions of migration, like forced migration or the refugee crisis we're talking about today, they can still be acts of empowerment where people can still shape a new identity and a new place for themselves in the world. So they connect almost any act of migration as one that can be at least potentially empowering. On the other hand, there is, justifiably so, a lot of literature talking about how disempowering it might be to have to move, to be forced to move, or not to be able to adapt to a new culture. So what I'm trying to say here is that it doesn't mean that if we move, and we know that from our experience, we move somewhere, we migrate, the world will be ours, the possibilities will be open, and it will be a horizon of possibility, a new horizon for us, and a new horizon of impossibility, depending on who we are, how we adapt, who we encounter, and so on. But still, the movement of people has traditionally been, an engine, again, of creativity and innovation. And just one last point, and I see I'm kind of behind time here. People have always migrated, and we know, if we look back at human history, before the constitution of nation states and boundaries and the invention of the passport, we have been on the move constantly. This defined humanity in many ways, movement. But especially nowadays, and of course it started, 18th, 19th century with the nation state and so on. But today, we have a resurgence of these very populist, very nationalist ideologies that basically tell us that it's unnatural to move. The natural condition of people is to stay put and be part of their country, of their community, of where they are. And it really goes against what we know historically humans have been doing all the time. So this is a very kind of a side observation, but I know Francesco and other people working on migration, I think would resonate with this. And finally, we need to talk about mind on the move, right? So there is a lot of psychological mobility beyond, above and beyond the corporeal, the physical. The power of imagination is exactly that, to be able to be in different places at the same time. And there are theories of imagination. Colleagues like Zitoun and Gillespie talk about the loop of imagination, how we go in and out of our immediate experience. You loop in and you loop out, and you go to different spaces of possibility, of probability, of the past, of the future, and so on. But even in this regard, we have to remember that the basis of our imagination and creativity remain physical acts of mobility. If children, and just to take the example of children at play, if we don't take children to different places, if we don't put them in touch with other points of view, other people, other objects, right? If they don't get to exchange positions, they will have no material on which their imagination can build. So although as adults, or we can still be very mentally mobile while we're physically immobile, there is a deeper connection between physical mobility and mental imaginative mobility. Okay, so very briefly, I'm going to tell you about the good news, because it might seem like, okay, so you basically told us that if we reduce our mobility, we're going to be slightly less creative, less possibilities, maybe more depressed, and so on. But of course, there is the point I wanted to make is that there is much more to mobility and much more to possibility, right, than physical movement or even creativity. And if we go back to the psychological realm, and especially to the online and virtual type of mobilities, which I didn't talk much about, basically we're engaged in one right now. We didn't have to move physically to meet, and yet this is a space, an encounter, a room we entered, and we're going to get out of, again, metaphorically, at the end of the talk. So I got inspired by how much creativity really I've seen online in terms of, for instance, this Reddit thread that was created. It was like a gift to researchers in many ways, a coronavirus memes thread. And I got to think, as a sociologist, I'm already becoming a sociologist. As a social psychologist, I got to think about what is the point, what is the purpose of these memes? What do people do by sharing these memes? They do many things. They try to make sense of their situation. They try to understand something that is kind of ununderstandable. It's unprecedented, the things we're witnessing. It's not completely unprecedented. There've been pandemics before, but the scale of it is quite unique. So we're trying to make sense out of it. We're trying to offer support. We're trying to build communities. We're trying to kind of lighten the day of other people, and to have this feeling that we're all in this together somehow. And we're also trying to be critical, to understand our political and economic system, and to be critical of it. I mean, the virus clearly gave us a lot of opportunities for doing that. So just to give you very quickly a few quite creative examples that I found on this Reddit forum. And to tell you before, so I'm engaged now together with my wife, who's also a psychologist, and a Romanian who's in the US, Ioana Literac. She's a media scholar in Teachers College, Columbia University. We're doing a study of, well, 22,000 memes collected from this Reddit thread. And we're using some kind of big data techniques together with qualitative research. I'm going to keep you posted on that. But for the moment, I just want to illustrate what this kind of creativity does. So here you have Tom, World War III never happened. Australia finally stopped burning, and then coronavirus hits you in the head like a pie. So we're trying to understand together, how does it feel, for this to have come now in our societies, right? What does it mean? Well, it might be like a pie in the face, but it's also like we've experienced some relief, and then this hit us, right? So different forms of meaning making. Another one, as I said, is offering support. So not all heroes wear capes. You've probably seen many of these praise for workers, healthcare workers, and other type of workers who are out there helping us, and helping society still not be completely coming to a halt. And another one is social critique. Another meme for the average American: the best way to tell if you have COVID-19 is to cough in a rich person's face and wait for their test results. So this is an opportunity also to think critically about inequality, power relations, oppression, and so on in society. So how does creativity operate here? I'm not going to make a big discussion. If you want, we can chat about it in the questions. But it seems to me that creativity operates through at least two processes. One of them is we're making the unfamiliar familiar, and the other one is that we're making the familiar unfamiliar. So the most creative memes in this study that we're conducting are those that help us shed some new light on what is happening. So, for instance, this is a tweet. This is like the exact opposite of what that Pokemon Go summer. If you remember the Pokemon Go phenomenon, everyone was on their phones and everyone was really clustering, grouping together to catch Pikachu wherever Pikachu appeared somewhere, or any other like important Pokemon. People would just run together, you know, to to catch the Pokemon. So what this meme is trying to do is looking at this unfamiliar situation. We have to stand apart. We can actually run away from each other. When you cross the street today, you know, we're fortunate in Switzerland. We always could get out if we wanted to. You cross quite far away from another person. So it's trying to make it familiar by anchoring it into an experience we kind of know. You know, you remember that summer where everyone was together chasing Pokemons? This is the opposite of that. So anchoring the unfamiliar into the familiar. And another one is to make the familiar unfamiliar. When you find out your normal daily lifestyle is called quarantine. So this is a funny one because, of course, we know our daily life. You know, being on a weekend, being tired or bored to get out, living in your PJs. Well, now we have another name for it. This is quarantine. So you're basically taking everyday life and you're giving it a new meaning. What would be the relation between what I do now in future weekends when we're not in quarantine and what I used to call the quarantine life, you know? So these are just a few examples of that. Now, where am I going to go from here? What are the questions that remain? So first of all, I think that it's important to problematize the linear connection between mobility and possibility. We see with these examples that there are different kinds of mobility people engage in, even within the pandemic. So virtual, online, psychological mobilities, and so on, and even physical mobilities. So there is a horizon of possibility associated with each one of those mobilities. And in the future, if we really believe in putting together these two approaches, possibility studies and new mobilities, we can inquire more into, for instance, what new possible mobilities will look like. Richard, again, to cite him, he works on automobility. So he's also partially interested in how we construct the cars of the future and what is the future of automobility. So what is the future of human mobility? How are we going to move in the future? Online, offline, with cars, with no cars, and so on. And another one is to look at mobile possibilities. How can we integrate mobility and recognize it as being somehow at the heart of phenomena like imagination, creativity, innovation? How can we encourage them if this is a true relationship, right? So the good news is actually that we should be able to find new ways to expand our range of mobility and contact, human contact, interpersonal contact, online, offline, even when living in confinement. And many people have done so. We're all doing it to keep our mental health and sanity, and not only to be creative. So just looking into that could be a very interesting venue for research. And the last thing I want to say is that remember that the impossible is not the absence of possibility, but it can be a starting point. And what I mean here is the observation I made at the beginning, that the impossible, as long as you can think about what is impossible for us, we can find ways, even with our imagination, to overcome what is impossible, right? We can't fly to Pluto, but we can imagine we did. And based on satellite images and so on, we can even try to imagine what it would be like to be on Pluto. Of course, we don't do that. But what I'm trying to say here is that human impossibility has often and always actually been throughout history a challenge that people, individuals, and communities wanted to raise up to and then overcome. So this is not very different from that. The impossibilities we're confronted with can be a starting point and not the end point. So what I've been working on, a few things. I'm happy to share these if you write me an email. So the book I told you is going to come out. It's called Mobility and Human Possibility. I also had one short paper called New Mobilities in Psychology. Why are we still not on the move? So for those of you who are interested in psychology and how psychologists integrated or not or responded to new mobilities, I'm happy to share this. It's going to come out, I think, on Friday. I have an entry in this encyclopedia on mobility and a paper on migration and affect and impossibility with a colleague from Neuchâtel, Gail Wormersley. And I'm working on this research, this big research on social media, memes, creativity, and we're working on a paper for Frontiers. Okay, so thank you. This was it. Comments and questions.
Well, exhaustive.
Or exhausting, I don't know. One of the two.
Clap? Can we clap first? Have a virtual applause session?
Thank you, thank you. I'm taking my imaginary cap off. Thank you, very kind, very kind.
So I opened the Q&A session, and I hope we have questions. I have questions if nobody has questions, by the way. I'm sure there will be questions.
Yes.
Nobody's asking questions.
You might have to jump for it, Francesco.
Okay. No, I'm very interested in what you're doing with memes. It might be my it's more than actually more than a question is a comment. And one of the things that I noticed, it's been like a wave during this COVID-19 lockdown of creativity. And I was thinking of you when I saw this. We said, look, how much people are developing. And I have to tell you that I was, at the beginning, it was fun. I don't know if it's the same experience for the others, receiving through WhatsApp groups, a lot of memes, videos, photographs, text. You see them, you smile, you laugh, and then it was overwhelming. Overwhelming. And I started not sending those things anymore. So up to the point that I didn't even look at those anymore. So I think that my question might be, where is the edge, the limit of between creativity and psychosis? And when we go over, and I'm not a psychologist, so but this is like a normal human being asking a psychologist, when can we recognize that actually that kind of flux flow of creativity is not creativity, but it becomes a way to get over panic.
Right.
That's how I think it was panic.
Thank you. I feel like you're making again the point of mobility, because in a way what you're asking me is, can we move on from creating and viewing all these memes? Yes, we have to move on eventually, because we explore kind of all the possibilities, and they serve a specific purpose at the beginning of the pandemic, maybe in the middle, maybe now. And then, of course, they lose some of that because of routine, right? And there's always this kind of struggle between creativity and routine and accommodation with something. Just one observation is very good point. So we study these memes longitudinally, and we make sure that, for instance, when we code for memes, we take them from each kind of week of the lockdown or different periods, because they change dramatically. I mean, Trump says this and that, and then it's an avalanche. I mean, the thing about, ingesting bleach, I mean, you can imagine. So first of all, it's very interesting temporally to see the dynamic and the change in terms of content. But I think you're right. I think your question is this any longer creativity? Now, my proposal, if you remember from these slides, was to look at the processes of what's happening. So making the familiar unfamiliar, making the unfamiliar familiar. And I feel that at some level, they still do that for many of us. Of course, it will depend. But of course, it's not the beginning and end of human creativity or human creativity in the lockdown. And it's not revolutionary creations, although a lot of activism and a lot of potential social change that will happen out of this will find its roots, or at least some resonance, in these forums with social critique through memes and so on. I don't know if I answered the question, but this is what came to my mind now.
Definitely, yeah. It was more a comment than as I said than a question. I think we had a question from Min Tang. I'm sorry you were muted.
Lisa.
Okay, now I can talk.
Hello,
Hi,
Lisa.
Vlad.
Hi.
Hi. Thank you. Like always, very thought-provoking talk. I really enjoy it.
I'm very happy because you have to know, everyone, that Lisa is a co-editor of that special issue of Frontiers that I mentioned. So I'm happy to hear you like it. Sorry, go on.
I'm so happy that you are preparing a manuscript for this special issue. And I want to follow up with you because we have touched base once about how to study creativity in social media. And just now you mentioned you are actually doing something. Can you tell me more about that, big data and all the stuff?
Right. Well, that's so we're not looking only at creativity. I have to be honest. We're looking at different things. So one of the things is meaning making. So we're preparing a paper in which we use something that's called the theory of social representations. That is a theory of how people collectively build knowledge about strange and new social objects. And you might think, well, the virus is not, it's a biological thing. But yeah, it is biological, but it's very much a social object that just crashed into all our societies, and we have to understand it, what's happening, right? So the theory of social representations is a theory that is kind of built on this premise. And the processes there are anchoring and objectification and similar processes. So anchoring, objectification, to take the first one, is giving a physical material form to the virus. The virus is invisible, it's very tiny, we can't see it, but we see a lot of the consequences of it, and we are all familiar with the image of it. And then in memes, for instance, you have all sorts of personifications of the virus. In a way, even the pie that hits Tom's face was the coronavirus, right? So that's an example of objectification, how different groups, different communities materialize the virus. Yeah. And the second one is anchoring. Anchoring in meaning making means what kind of areas of life you bring in to understand the pandemic. So one type of anchoring might be very political. So some people think of the virus in terms of political parties, ideologies, inequality. So they anchor the debate in the sphere of the political. But of course, the same people might do it, relating to economic issues. So, for instance, someone would talk about how low-skilled workers now become how do you call those workers? I'm sorry, I have a lapsus. Essential workers nowadays. So an economic category, it used to be like these migrants, low skill, whatever, we don't care about them. Now they're essential. Now they're heroes and so on. So it's kind of a very kind of an economic shift there. So yes, we're looking at meaning making, and for the special issue, we prepared the abstract I have to submit to you. We're looking at the way in which coders look at what's the relation between the score of creativity, how different people would score how creative a meme is in terms of different components, like we know from the literature, originality, meaningfulness, elaboration, and so on, and the karma score, or the voting that happens in the community. So can we say that if memes are very much voted highly, that makes them more creative? And I probably shouldn't say this because we have to publish it, but no, we cannot say that. So in Premiere, actually, Constance, my wife, she worked today on those findings, but we're going to submit an abstract. So yeah, we're looking at these different things. But I can chat with you much more on on exactly what we do.
Very exciting. As you mentioned, I just post the link in the chat area.
Yes, please do.
And all of you, if you are interested, and just submit an abstract. And the deadline for the submission of abstract is the 1st of July. And it's an unusual process. Actually, in Frontiers, you can submit the manuscript directly. But this time we've got a deal from Frontiers. Usually it's very expensive to publish there. But this time they like our proposal. They say if we have the study about COVID-19 and creativity innovation, we will waive the costs. But our task is to, as the goalkeeper, we collect the abstracts and say, Frontiers, we are sure it's the paper about this topic.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. So you see new possibilities. Do you see how the mobility of the pandemic emerged new possibilities? At least this one. I don't know how much people are excited.
It's genius. It's really, because the whole time I'm thinking about why. Because every day is every day is everywhere, every second we can observe it. But why? And it seems is a direct link to the quarantine time. But then I forgot, and then that's why we need you, Vlad. And your point to us is mobility. And it is
That's why I'm
really
giving this talk. No, I'm joking. Thank you. Thanks, Lisa.
yeah, really like it.
Thanks. Anyone else?
Can I interrupt?
I'm bracing myself.
No, thank you. That was wonderful. It was excellent.
Thank you. Thanks.
I'm very impressed. But I do have I do have it's not really a negative comment, but it's a slightly critical.
Constructive. Yes, please do.
Well, that I think that the way, well, at least how you've described it here, maybe it's different in the book, is too positive in the way in which you describe mobility. I think there's a lot of negative aspects of it, which I also think coronavirus has made quite clear. There's some positive things, many positive things about it. When I look out the window, there's no airplane tracks out in the sky, right? And we live in a world where much of the mobility that we depend on is actually not sustainable at all. So I think that's one thing about mobility. Just my own area of automobility. It's not so much that I'm sort of trying to bring about different types of cars, the future I'd like to imagine. And I found this really wonderful in your discussion about possibility studies. And this is work I'm doing with a colleague in Vienna, is to imagine a post-automobility future, basically a future without automobiles, where we have other ways of moving around. And I think one of the points that John Ury made in his work on automobility is that one aspect of it is, yes, it gives us a certain kind of mobility, but it is a mobility that we're required to have. You have to have an automobile. There's societies where if you want to move, there is in fact no other way to get around. And so that was just a couple of examples there. And migration, I agree with almost everything you say, in particular the point about places like, I don't know, for example, I guess Hungary is perhaps the best example now
I didn't want to say it.
Yeah, of countries that basically see movement, migration across their borders as a bad thing. It's an element, I think, also of Brexit. But there's another aspect of migration. And I think if you look at the last, hundreds of 4 or 5 centuries, I mean, the great migration movements are really of European peoples to the New World, to North America, South America, Australia, where I'm from. And I've been reading a book by Carl Schmitt. It's called The Nomos of the Earth recently. And it's really a history of sort of the great land appropriations by the Europeans, primarily Portuguese, Spanish, French, and British, that have essentially just appropriated entire continents. And for the indigenous inhabitants, this was not at all a positive development. I think that's obvious, but I just wanted to, point out.
No, I think this is great, and thank you for the comment. And I realize, and I hope in the book I didn't do this, because it's something that keeps coming back to me, not as a critique, as an observation. As a creativity researcher, creativity tends to have a very positive kind of sphere of connotations around it. But of course, there is so much negative creativity. People started talking more and more about malevolent creativity, negative creativity. And there are many questions about what, something is creative for whom and does good for whom, and who does it, hurts. So these discussions are coming back and back and, coming into being. But one point I want to make, and I think I'll be probably a bit controversial, and now I'm recorded, so I'll be kind of, reminded of it forever. Is possibility always a good thing? So mobility, we definitely know that, but is always having more possibility better? Think about being in a shop and seeing full meters after meters of cheese or yogurt. I mean, if you see cheese and you're from France or Switzerland, you maybe are excited. I'm not, actually. So too much possibility can be blocking, and sometimes can be disempowering, and sometimes can make you anxious, and so on. So I do take the point. Obviously, I have to be careful with that, but I don't want to leave any of you with this implication that it's always for the better. Both possibility and mobility have very big dark sides to them. Yeah.
I agree with that, Vlad. And because we are also observing the creative cases in the coronavirus period, and it's so true. It's like the virus is like an amplifier. Everything will become bigger through the virus, and also creativity. If we look around, there are positive creativity, but also malevolent creativity. And it's happening in every corner of the world. Yeah, just comment.
Francesco, you wanted to say as well?
There was a question from Juliana. She wrote it.
Juliana.
She said, are you also taking into account the geography of where the memes originate, proliferate? I'm giving her voice.
The geography, sorry.
Thanks, Francesco. I forgot that I asked the question.
Can you re-ask it? Sorry, Francesco gave you voice, but I didn't grasp fully the voice.
Let me find the chat again. Are you, because you were mentioning how you were taking into account in the study of memes the time periods, which is super important, right? To track the sort of evolution of how people feel. But are you also tracking geographies, since, you know?
Well, according to GDPR, we shouldn't, I think. I'm joking. Well, it's a very good question of location, because we need to be very aware that the meme phenomenon and Reddit and participants to Reddit come from particular places in the world. It's usually very Western, all of these places, most of them. English is used very often. But beyond even the country specificity, there is a meme culture that you can be part of or outside of it, and it will matter a lot how you evaluate, how you make sense of the meme, how you appreciate it, how you find it creative or not. These are part of the findings we have, by the way, for the study we're going to submit. So who you are looking at the meme will matter a lot. And if you're in the inside of the meme or outside of the meme, if you're the viewer for that meme or not. And this is another kind of dark side. Now I'm being, it's contagious what Richard's, when he points to the dark side, I'm kind of seeing it everywhere. But memes can also be part of discrimination in a way. You build communities and you can be inside of them and understand, get the jokes, get the meme and so on, or you can feel like you're outside of them. So yeah, who you are and where you're talking from is very important. We don't collect information about exactly geographically where things happen, but we do assume this is very much a Western and kind of meme culture phenomenon. So it's a bit of a bubble, and we don't want to overgeneralize. It's not like everyone will go online or will do this. It's a fairly big bubble. I mean, we're all kind of partially part of it in many ways. Yeah.
Vlad, may I ask a question? I apologize for my.
Sorry, Phyllis. There's a Connie questions before, and then you can go.
Okay.
Connie, thank you for joining.
Yeah, hi. It's great to see everyone today, Vlad. I'm really glad that you're continuing your thoughts and research on positivity and possibilities, and it's interesting to see this dichotomy between mobility and possibilities. Actually, I'd like to make an observation. There are a few people in the world like myself whose life did not change that much. I'm already an online professor, so I already stay at home. I already work at home. I'm here with my cat all day. I'm already by myself, So of course my world changed a lot, but in some ways I didn't have all this craziness of what day is it, a lot of people had to decide whether they were going to get dressed or not. I made those determinations years ago. I figured out how to manage my time at home. So there are some of us out there, and I'd also like to suggest that the teachers are part of those essential workers too, because teacher educator, and I watched as my teachers had to make huge adaptations, and they missed their students. You know, there's looked at mobility between students, children, and teachers in the elementary and secondary schools that changed a lot. And I'm thinking about within this dichotomy of mobility and possibilities that there's a certain elasticity or equalizing effect. There's some elements of that involve emotion. And someone else mentioned that a few minutes ago, the emotion of it. And I think there's a lot of mobility with emotion in that social psychology. I would like to give an example of that. In some ways, we're all equalized right now. It doesn't matter if you're the president, if you're an essential worker, if you are in the new norm of quarantine in your daily life, we're all equal. So for instance, you can get on YouTube and watch the show Some Good News. Have you seen that?
Yes. Yes.
Some of you have seen Some Good News. So, you know, the intro is very homemade. You know, his daughters made the sign, Some Good News. So here we have a well-known media figure who is in our living room, and he's in his living room. In fact, we're all in our living rooms, you know? So everyone all of a sudden has connected in an impossible way. I have never seen some of these movie stars' homes before, you know? And now I know exactly, and everyone is just very natural about it. That I think the emotional side of it, of reconnecting with, like, oh, I'm assuming this is your home, Vlad, not your office.
It's an office. Yeah,
well,
that's
it's
not
your
my
home office.
No,
so
home,
you know,
yeah.
we're all in our homes. We're all in, you know, our cat comes and sits behind us. The dog barks. You know, all those kinds of things. So the elasticity of becoming equalized,
right?
People that we would not have connected with in an intimate way, meaning like I never expected to be in so-and-so's living room before, you know, learning new vocabulary from South Africa, some of the memes that I follow there. And they just, those memes bring us together emotionally. And so those are some observations.
No, thank you, Connie. This is really, I feel like affect is, I have an interest. I told you, I could even share, and I told I can share with anyone these pieces, but I have a paper on migration and affect and possibility. But one observation I want to just make, this shouldn't be interpreted as let's go and move more and more is going to be much better. Again, it's this kind of positivity thing. We have to recognize and celebrate settled lives. You know, many people are immobile from some perspective, but only from some perspective, not all perspectives. If you think about Immanuel Kant, he was allegedly or famously never traveled outside of a few kilometers or, you know, outside of his town, and lived a very kind of routine-based life. And he created ideas that, of course, inspire us through the ages. So it's not as simple as that. And that's an important point, you know, to raise. I know we're almost out of time. So Phyllis, I don't know if you want to also add a question or...
I have a quick question. It's really nice to see you, and I really look forward to this. I just wanted to add on to Juliana's concept about the geographic locations, as well as just to put in a plug for perhaps the cultural context of the meme. I had a student this time who talked often about the Egyptian meme culture and how strong it was over this time of the coronavirus. So I just wanted to ask whether you're looking at it in that way at all.
No, sadly, we can't. Well, there are limits of language often. And Lisa, who contributed and came, I mean, she and we talked because she has contacts in China. It'd be very interesting to see social media from China. So that might still happen, but it would be very important, yes, to go back to cultural anchoring. In some ways, we are very globalized in terms of meme culture, and some formats are traveling widely. So I wouldn't be surprised to find them in China, in Egypt, and other places. But in others, they're very local as well. So yeah, it's a big question.
Thank you.
Good. Thank you. I don't know. I would love to talk about this for hours, but I do know it's 7, and I'll leave it to Francesco to direct.
We should 7, but I mean, I also have some comments, but we'll probably continue the conversation directly. And it's very nice when the conversation actually moves on and you don't want to stop, because frankly, it's really smooth and nice. So for me, it's hard to say, okay, now the end of the game. I don't know if you have one other question. Maybe we can have it.
I see there were questions from wow, beautiful comments here. I should, but yeah, right-wing material on Reddit. yes, there is, but not as much. So again, a media question is where you collect this meme from. So if you go on 4chan versus Reddit versus, it will be a very big difference. Yeah. But what I found is that people are really building this sense of community, and we're all in this together. And what Connie said as well, the big equalizer for our experience is the big one, changes to everyday life, how we're all in this together. And then there is a social critique. And I feel like a lot of activist voices have been emboldened by this. And usually they're not necessarily, I mean, there is, and then there is the anti-vax debate, and I mean, it really kind of comes and anchors itself in the concerns of every society. But yeah, it's fascinating. So I want to thank you very much for the opportunity to present, and I hope we're going to continue this conversation. When the book comes out, I might do a little thing at Webster, maybe online, and happy to share with you guys, and then we can just plant the seed of an idea and then see where it grows.
Definitely. Yeah. Before we conclude, let me show these, which is going to be the next event on Thursday, June 11th, with Julie Smith, our colleague from St. Louis. She's a media expert, so she will talk about the role of social media regarding misinformation on COVID-19. So somehow I think it will be connected to what we discussed today in terms of memes. And I see a kind of a red line from my presentation the first time when I was talking about photographs, and when you were mentioning object, creating an object, I mean, giving a physical aspect to something that is not visible, the virus, something that I reconnected to. So I'm very, very happy that we did these, and we'll continue the conversation. So thank you very much for everyone.
Very much. Thank you all.
I conclude here.
Mobile creative lives, but live them as you want.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Vlad. See ya.